Hello everyone. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all those who are listening in today. This is the second in the series of 3 talks on St. Thomas the Apostle, and the first was on the blessed city of Edessa. Today, in the second talk, I'd like to discuss the dominant histories in primarily Western academic circles, which is in contradiction to the Syrian Christian narrative. Now, according to the Syrian Christian narrative and tradition, a certain king called Gondophares sent his emissary called Haban to Palestine to procure for himself a master carpenter, and according to Jesus' directive, he brought back St. Thomas. Now, St. Thomas travelled up and down the country in Kerala, having arrived there in the year 52 AD, and preaching the gospel and working amazing miracles, he is thought to have converted a large body of Christians scattered over 7 or 8 different places. And he is then supposed to have gone over to the east coast of southern India, called the Coromandel coast, where he was martyred and buried in a city called Mylapore. Now, most Western historians reject this narrative. For the past 300 years, the narrative has been built up, point by point, rejecting every aspect of the Syrian Christian tradition. What began with Lacroze in 1724 and expanded by James Howe in 1839 became more strident and elaborated in the 19th century with historians like Milner, Hunter, Burkitt, etc., and into the 20th century with further luminaries like Alphonse Mingana, Stephen Neil, etc. Continuing into the 21st century, this trend has continued with historians like David Wilmshurst, etc. This 300-year-long historical rejection of the Syrian Christian tradition has created in primarily Western academic and scholarly circles a narrative that has become the dominant one, eclipsing the Syrian Christians' own narrative. It is alleged that the Syrian Christians got their story completely wrong by misunderstanding people by the same name being held by different people, or the Syrian Christians had borrowed the narrative from Syriac stories or martyrologies or Syriac liturgy, or may have invented their own stories, all for the purpose of self-aggrandization by placing themselves in high honor among the first converts to Christianity in India. Now, this is a serious allegation, imputing either a simple lack of discernment, or pride, or dishonesty of the most base kind on the part of the Indian Christians, and as such, this is an allegation which no other Christians appear to have been put under, and consequently this requires an exhaustive study. So today I'd like to present to you each of the supposed evidence for this rejection and critically examine them. I would also like to examine the arguments presented around them to see if these arguments are based on sound interpretation and good reasoning. The first argument presented is the question of long-distance travel. It is argued that St. Thomas could not have come to Kerala, or in the Portuguese times the region was called Malabar. He could not have travelled the 3,000 miles between Palestine and Kerala. However, this is surprising because even in pre-Christian times, historians have recorded the extensive trade between the Mediterranean and the coastal regions of India from Gujarat all the way down to the tip of the Indian peninsula and further east to Bengal and to even to China. The Nile was linked to the Red Sea as early as in Pharaoh's times, which Alexander's successor Ptolemy II is thought to have reopened in the 3rd century. The journeys from Alexandria to Malabar, according to historical accounts, took several routes. One was up the River Nile and then across the desert to the Red Sea and further southeast towards the island of Socotra, and then to land hop all along the coast to reach the entire Indian subcontinental ports. The other route was going across to Mesopotamia, from where, going southeast, you could reach the Persian Gulf, where from the island of Hormuz, again, you could do the same. Apart from this maritime route, there were also other overland caravan routes between the Nile and the Red Sea, and historians like Herodotus and Pliny of the 1st century, and an important work called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, all mention this trade. In fact, Pliny the First mentions that extensive trade was going on between Alexandria and the Far East, and in fact he mentions all the ports along the route from northwestern India in Gujarat all the way to Bengal and beyond, and also mentions the tradable goods available in these places. Apart from that, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written by an unknown author in the 1st century AD in the Greek language, states that this journey was frequently undertaken by navigators and merchants. In fact, he states also that in the year 40 AD, a navigator called Hippalus had discovered the southwestern and northeastern monsoon winds, which later came to be called the trade winds, by which you didn't need to land hop anymore and cut the journey time considerably by traveling right across the Arabian Sea. Hippalus in fact states that setting off from Alexandria, you could reach the spice markets of Kerala in just over 3 months. All this goes to show there was widespread travel across from the Palestine region overland and by sea, and it is quite probable that St. Thomas could have travelled to India along any of these routes. The second reason historians discredit the Syrian Christian tradition is given as India, the term India being an imprecise one. Now, according to many and numerous historians of the pre-Christian and early Christian era, trade with India was a coveted prize. The first monopoly of this trade was with the Nabatean Phoenicians, whose capital was Petra. It is thought that they kept the source of spices a secret. They also spread the idea that the spices that they traded in originated in Arabia, and the southern part of Arabia thus came to be known as India of the spices. However, the location of the real India of the spices was also well known, especially after the monopoly fell into the hands of the Romans after the conquest of Egypt by the Romans at the turn of the 1st century. We see this in Ptolemy's map, as you can see, and the island in the middle is Sri Lanka, and just north is India without the peninsular India properly shown. It is shown just as lying on the east-west axis. After the Roman Empire, this trade was monopolized by the Arab traders, who again kept the source of the spices a secret, reinforcing the notion that spices originated in Arabia. As I said, again, undoubtedly, the location and spread of the real India was also known, definitely from the time of Alexander the Great, as a region lying to the east of the river Indus. It is clear that when church fathers and historians of the early Christian era mentioned India in connection with St. Thomas, the real India was meant. However, there are some historians who do mention that the Christians of a certain part called India was converted by someone else other than St. Thomas. And this brings us to the third reason put forward by historians to discredit the Syrian tradition. And this is in connection with an Alexandrian theologian called Pantanaeus. Now, Pantanaeus is thought to have traveled to a place he calls India, and he says he met Christians there, and they claimed that they were converted to Christianity by Saint Bartholomew the Apostle. He discovered a copy of the Hebrew Bible in their hands, and returning to Alexandria, he wrote his account in about 190 AD, stating that he saw Christians in India who were converted by Saint Bartholomew. Now, when you examine this closely, you realize that there is a serious misunderstanding on the part of 300 years of historical thinking among scholars of Indian Christianity. The matter is easily resolved by recalling my earlier statement that the southern part of Arabia was called the India of the spices. This was in fact a Jewish Christian kingdom called the Himyarite kingdom, situated in ancient Yemen. It was called Ethiopia as well as India. Mosheim, the great 19th century German historian, also attests to this, saying that the place that Pantanaeus claims he went to was not the real India, but Arabia Felix, which is the southwestern coast of Arabia. The late Patriarch of Antioch of the Syrians, Yaqub III, a scholar and historian, also explains this as follows. Sheba is the kingdom of Yemen. Historically, it is also known as the Himyarite kingdom, but it was also called Ethiopia and India. Now, it is more reasonable and evidence-based analysis to see that there is absolutely no tradition at any time in history or by any people of the South Indian tradition that Pantanaeus or Bartholomew ever came to their country or preached Christianity to them. A great deal of literature regarding Saint Bartholomew or Saint Matthew in the Himyarite kingdom exists. So it is baffling, to say the least, to note that this geographical displacement of India is used as an argument to discredit the St. Thomasin mission in the real India. The next piece of evidence presented by historians is that of a work called The Acts of Thomas. The narrative contained in this 3rd century book, which was written in the 3rd century in Edessa by an unknown author, is very interesting. Several prominent Western historians consider the Acts as the earliest documentary evidence to St. Thomas's missionary journeys. The difficulty arises when scholars tried to evaluate the Syrian Christian traditions of St. Thomas through the analysis of this book. The first chapters of this book, called Acts of St. Thomas, also names the same king as in the Syrian Christian traditions, Gondophares, at whose behest St. Thomas travelled to India to build a palace for the king. The story was at first used to discredit the Syrian Christian account on the grounds that such a king never existed. However, when numismatic evidence turned up in the 19th century of this king having been a real king who existed in the 1st century, scholars painstakingly retracted their steps and created a new narrative to state that St. Thomas's mission was in the region of Afghanistan. The problem here is that the Gondophares story is only one of the stories in the Acts of St. Thomas. Historians who discredit the Syrian Christian account appear to use these other stories to further their argument. But these other stories, noticeably, are absent in the narratives of the Syrian Christians of Kerala. So there is a serious dichotomy here. Besides, this book is also discredited as a heretical work by the same historians and also by church historians. Nevertheless, it is curious to see that the dominant histories at present use this text as a touchstone to test the historical narratives of South Indian Christians and point out all the inconsistencies between text and narrative. It appears that they have not taken into account the fact that the stories contained in the Acts of Thomas after the Gondophares story are unknown to the Syrian Christians and are non-existent in their narrative. So, it appears that when set alongside the Syrian Christian narratives, the story of Gondophares is only one among the many stories in southern India. So, the narrative of the Syrian Christians appear to have greater coherence, internal consistency, and also validity derived from centuries of unchanging local traditions. The next argument put forward is that of Cosmas's testimony. Even in the 21st century, this argument is vehemently put forward by Western historians, and so this needs careful examination. Cosmas was a 6th century Alexandrian merchant. He travelled down the west coast of India and recorded that he found Christians all along the coastal regions of India. But he does not mention St. Thomas as the apostle of Kerala. Noticeably, he does not mention St. Bartholomew either. But this account is presented as a critical piece of evidence against the Thomasine tradition of the Keralites. From it, it is extrapolated that Christianity arrived in India just before Cosmas wrote his account, that is, in the 5th century, thus discrediting the Thomasine tradition. However, Cosmas records many details such as bishops, priests, and deacons governing the Christians of Kerala, indicating that what he saw in Kerala was a flourishing and well-established church. If it was established only a few decades before his time, it could not have been so ecclesiastically well organized. A close reading of Cosmas reveals that it was a well-established and stable church that he witnessed, and such stability and ecclesiastical order to govern it would not have happened if it had been established only just prior to his arrival. It also appears that the dating of Christianity in India, not in the 1st century but in the 5th century, was only to fit with Cosmas's account, thus making this piece of evidence discredited. The next piece of evidence put forward is that of the place of martyrdom of St. Thomas according to the ancient accounts. Eusebius and some other church historians give Calamina as the name of name of the place of St. Thomas's martyrdom. So some historians in the Western academic circles have argued that Mylapore entered the narrative only much later, only when the Syrian Christians began copying this idea from the martyrologies or liturgies or hymns handed to them through the Syriac language, and that and also through some of the later church fathers of the 7th and 8th centuries. But they also say, especially Eusebius, say that Calamina was a city in India. Now, numerous modern historians have tried their utmost in their efforts to defend the Syrian Christians' tradition that this contradiction could be resolved, suggesting that perhaps Mylapore was a corruption of Calamina, Coromandel, or Cholamandalam, or perhaps even a Hellenization of the word Glamona, none of which appear convincing. The most plausible explanation is much more simple. Nunes Barreto, a Portuguese historian of the 16th century, states that according to the accounts he heard from the Coromandel coast fishermen, that there was indeed an ancient city called Calamina on the Coromandel coast, which was taken by the sea. Barreto states that Mylapore, which was quite some distance from the sea at that time, itself was reduced to ruins as a result of this tidal surge. In fact, it is an archaeologically proven fact that great cities such as Puhar or Kaveripumpattanam or Mahabalipuram, etc., were lost to the sea in ancient times. So, the scholars are right in noting that Mylapore entered the Syrian Christian narrative at a later date. However, that does not negate the fact that Mylapore and Calamina both signify the burial place of St. Thomas on the east coast of India, although the actual site of the tomb, that is Calamina, was taken by the sea. The South Indian Christians continued to regard the next nearest place, which was Mylapore, as St. Thomas's place of martyrdom and the location of his tomb. In fact, according to some very interesting 12th century accounts, one of which was given before the Pope of Rome by a traveller, St. Thomas's tomb was on an island surrounded by the sea. Here there was an annual miracle when, on the feast day of the Apostle, the sea waters receded, making it possible for the pilgrims to reach the tomb, and afterwards the sea rose again, cutting off access. This helps to dispel the confusion, and it is sufficient argument to discredit the challenge on this count. The sixth argument put forward is that the St. Thomas Christians are not indigenous people, but immigrants who came in successive waves during the persecution of the Christians in Persia. While the Syrian Christian narratives affirm the arrival of two waves of Mesopotamian settlers, it is clearly shown in Syrian Christian narratives that they were assimilated into the greater body of the native Christians on arrival. This argument is not supported by any this argument is supported by the facts on the ground in Kerala. The native-born St. Thomas Christians are deeply embedded within the predominantly Hindu fabric of society, which indicates that they were not outsiders. One can compare the example of the Syrian Christians with the Parsis of Gujarat. Although the Parsis have integrated themselves very well with the local milieu, there are distinctive features which, after 1,200 years, still keep them apart from the mainstream society in Gujarat. This is not the case with the Syrian Christians of Kerala. Apart from bearing close resemblance to their fellow Keralites in their physiognomy, they are also culturally almost indistinguishable to the majority Hindus, apart from their religious practices. So this argument can also be set aside. The seventh argument put forward by historians is that the Syrian Christians' narrative counts Brahmins as one of the first groups to be converted into Christianity by St. Thomas. This is based on the mainstream historical accounts that assert that Brahmins arrived in Kerala only in the 8th or 9th centuries. However, according to several other historians, including the famous book called Keralolpati, Brahmins arrived in Kerala in the 2nd century BC. And there are also other historians and also reference points like the Brahmin website, or called the Nambudiri website on the internet, attest to this fact. This is a detail I couldn't go into here. However, several factors seem to give some level of credibility to the Syrian Christian claim that at least leading members of their community converted to Christianity came from the Brahmin community in Kerala. Social factors also point to this possibility, especially looking at the close affinity between leading families of the Syrian Christians and the Brahmins on the basis of several factors, including the names of their clans, the names of their landed properties, and their social, cultural, and religious rituals and practices. Similarly, the fact that the extremely nuanced customs and practices of the Syrian Christians, culturally and in their religion, bear close resemblance to the practices of the Kerala Brahmins, indicating a historical link between the two communities. It is, while it is not possible to go into details, I'd like to give a short list of these parallels which I have observed in the daily rituals of private life and public conduct of these two communities. And these include prescribed and rigid rules of bathing, fasting, modes of prayer, the highly prescriptive Vedic practices of the Brahmins on personal and social taboos, which are also followed by the Syrian Christians in many instances, such as the rituals and practices relating to clean and unclean objects and concepts linked to death, corpse, funeral, mildew, cleansing of pots and vessels, skin diseases, bodily effluents, etc. The anacharams and acharams, such as do not bathe before sunrise, cook only after bathing, etc. The taboos on against marrying close relatives of the same clan, the practice of aitam, all these are good examples of this. Above all, it is arguable that in the light of rigid caste demarcations in the unique social structure of Kerala, This left conversion to another religion left very little room for people to practice their religion or to be an apostate and to be tolerated within that society. The fact that the newcomers were not killed outright, the new converts were not killed outright or chased out of the country, which is what would have happened to any other caste in similar circumstances, points only to this probability that at least some of them were of the Brahmin community. It could reasonably also argue that it was the membership in the Brahmin clan network by at least some portion of the new Christians that ensured their safety from intense persecution, in fact death itself, because it was a grave sin to kill a Brahmin. So this reasoning can also be discredited as one against the Syrian Christian narrative. The eighth reason put forward by historians is that of the veneration of the cross, which Syrian Christians claim that St. Thomas himself introduced to Kerala by the statement that he erected crosses. The general tradition that is accepted in Western Christianity is that Empress Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine, discovered the cross in the time between 315 and 325 AD. I have not studied this subject closely, but I wish to present to you two other theories regarding two other women who bore the name Helena. According to the doctrine of Mar Adai, the Empress Helena was not Constantine's mother, but the wife of Emperor Claudius, who lived in the 1st century. After converting to Christianity in Rome from the evangelical mission of St. Peter and St. Paul, this Empress Helena is thought to have traveled to Jerusalem, demanding to see Golgotha and the cross of Jesus. And she, in a narrative which is similar to the other story of Constantine's mother, she was able to ascertain the divine power of the wooden cross. The second Helena is the wife of the king of Edessa called Abgar V, and she too lived in the 1st century AD, and she went to Jerusalem in the time of the same Roman Emperor Claudius, after Jesus' crucifixion, etc. And there was a famine at this time when, using her immense wealth, she is thought to have bought in Egypt vast quantities of grain and distributed it among the people of Jerusalem. And the Jewish historian Josephus also mentions this. Helena's tomb is a truly remarkable one, and it is still to be seen before one of the gates in the city of Jerusalem. It is proposed that it was she who discovered the true cross at such an early stage. Whatever the origin of the story of the finding of the true cross, there are countless instances in the practice of the holy apostles themselves of the veneration of the cross and the making of the sign of the cross on people's foreheads and on the elements of bread and wine, etc., as seen in early Christian writings. I shall mention only some of these from two sources, the Doctrine of Adai and William Wright's Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles. According to these sources, the young apostle St. John used to wear a wooden cross around his neck under his garments. He placed a wooden cross upright in an easterly direction, and himself and a mass of people who had converted to Christianity prostrated themselves before it. And when the whole city of Ephesus were converted to Christianity, the colossal statues of the the goddess Artemis that used to adorn the city gates of Ephesus were all replaced by material crosses, which were erected at that point. Similarly, Apostle Philip and Apostle Andrew also are thought to have used symbols of the cross. So what we see is the general pattern of the apostles' collective recognition of the symbolism of the cross and the actual veneration of material representations of it, according to these ancient accounts. In the light of this, the narrative of the Syrian Christians that St. Thomas erected crosses in Kerala stands on firm basis, and it could no longer be discredited in my thinking. The last reason put forward is that most of the stories regarding St. Thomas in Kerala, in the over 7 places where he is thought to have converted people to Christianity, are described as being aetiological and hence not worthy of credit. Now, aetiological implies they all sound the same, and hence the allegation is that they all came from one source. All the 7 places were copying the same story, and thus making the whole account unworthy of credit. Now, this is a part of the argument I'd like to discuss in the third part of my talk, where I shall go into the details of the Syrian Christian narrative itself. I would like to conclude by stating that, by all these accounts, the certainty of long-distance travel in the 1st century AD, why India is not to be confused with Arabia Felix, that Pantaleus went to Arabia Felix and not to our India, that the narrative contained in the book Acts of Thomas has no relevance for the religious history of the Syrian Christians of Kerala, that there is no contradiction between Kalamina and Mylapore for historical reasons, that the Syrian Christians of Kerala are mostly consisting of indigenous Christians and not foreigners, and that some ancestral links with Brahmins are visible in the social and cultural life of the Syrian Christians, and also, most importantly, that St. Thomas did erect crosses, are all in keeping with the practice of all the apostles. Considering all this, the Syrian Christian narrative of their religious origins by the agency of St. Thomas the Apostle of Christ appears to stand on very firm grounds. So far in my study of this, I have not encountered any other mention anywhere of any other evangelist first introducing Christianity among the people of South India, or at any time other than between 52 and 72 AD. In my third talk in this series, I hope to build on this by re-examining in greater detail the Syrian Christian tradition, to bring to you the details contained in it, and to examine these traditions' consistency and credibility. Thank you very much for listening.
താൻ വേഗം സംപ്രാ